Right, so now that we've gone through the first part of this, we looked at, why people support one side or the other. Now in the second part, we're going to kind of look at the conflict a little bit more and kind of unpick some of the things with it. And the main thing that I've kind of realised, having been to Israel and Palestine myself and seen it for myself and everything, and, spoken to people on the ground, spoken to Israelis on the ground, spoken to Palestinians on the ground, etc. And what I tend to find is that, in most situations in life, you could kind of say the same thing for like, left and right wing politics in this country and elsewhere in the world. It's quite difficult to have a dialogue with people if you don't understand the other people's point of view, right? If you don't understand their talking points. And so, that's kind of the main thing to really bear in mind with this. It's a thing of, how many people, when you're talking about Israel or Palestine, how many of them, if they're pro-Israel, like how many of them actually understand the talking points for the Palestinian side? And similarly, if you support the Palestinian side, how much are you aware of like the talking points of the Israeli side? And on top of that, I've realized that the debate about it is very much a question of when do you start the history from, right? And that might sound a bit strange, but, for many people, like if you're starting the conversation from 1967, you tend to obviously be like a pro-Palestinian because since 1967, with the occupation of West Bank and Gaza, etc., that from that point on, it seems that Israel is obviously the dominant power, and Palestine is the much weaker power. And so many people, if they're starting the history from that point, they will have a certain point of view. Similarly as well, if you start the history from 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel, then that's also another talking point, right? And some people as well will also have the talking point starting almost 100 years ago with the Balfour Declaration. This is when the British decided that they were going to split the region between a Jewish homeland and an Arab homeland, right? So again, depending on when you start history from is very much dependent on like where you kind of go at it from, because all those that are just kind of laid out there tend to be talking points that the Arab side tend to have. Whereas if you take a look at it from the Jewish side, you have to take in consideration at least the last 3,000 years of history in that region and in the rest of the world, before you can fully kind of come to terms with it. So that's very much the kind of thing, like how aware are people of the actual deeper history of these things, right? And just looking at objectively, it's, one will kind of be skewed one way or the other, but I think a lot of people tend not to have this very broad view. Most people, they see what's on the news, they see like a very powerful Israeli army bombing very poor people who are largely defenseless and stuff. And if you just stop the presses there and don't understand the wider context of it, then it becomes a quite black and white kind of thing, right? But if you kind of take in consideration the entire history of that region, then it becomes a little bit more complicated. So that's kind of what we're going to go into now. So for instance, if we were to start it, with the creation of the State of Israel, right? Many Palestinians will make the point of the so-called Nakba, right? This is in Arabic, that means that the catastrophe, right? So this is the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinian Arabs from the land which is now Israel, right? And if you kind of, again, if you just look at the thing there and just, then it becomes very much a thing where, it's a kind of like a settler, like a colonial settler kind of like society, where you've expelled like the natives and, so that's one way of looking at it. However, the flip side of that is that in the Middle East, at the time of the creation of Israel, there was up to 1 million Jews living in that region, right? And the question is, what happened to those Jews after Israel was created, right? Did they, were they living in peace? Like, did they just decide to chill there? No, there's something called the Aliyah. I'm probably butchering the Hebrew word there, right? But it's a thing where, over the first 3 years of Israel's creation, between 1948 and 1951, you had the expulsion of about 250,000 Jews from Middle Eastern countries. And over the preceding decades, it ended up being a thing where up to 850,000 Jews were expelled from different Muslim countries, right? So places like Morocco, places like Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, many of these places, Yemen, they had sizable Jewish communities beforehand. Look at the communities now. They're almost non-existent. In some cases, there's literally officially 0 Jews living in some of these countries, right? And so, everything's all hunky-dory there. why did so many of them leave? And the reality is that many of them were expelled. And even before the creation of the State of Israel, you had a lot of discrimination against Jews by the Arabs and like Muslims in that kind of region in general. And this is something we discussed in our previous videos about like, the history of anti-Semitism. And, so definitely give those videos a check out. Yeah, like kind of, there should be links in the description somewhere or wherever, or it should appear on the screen at some point. But, like that's the whole point. Yeah, like kind of like Jews were not safe in the Middle East, and they weren't safe in Europe. They weren't safe anywhere they've been. So, they've been expelled time and time again. So you can understand from a Jewish perspective why they'd be quite paranoid and why sometimes they might overreact here when they're trying to do things, because, Israel is a tiny, tiny little country. Yeah, you can drive across it, like when you go in a bus, you can kind of drive across the entire thing in about 45 minutes or so. It's a tiny, tiny place. At its shortest point, it's something like 19 miles, wide, right? And, from their perspective, having people firing rockets into their country when their country is quite tiny as it is, you can kind of get where they're coming from. When they're surrounded by like hostile neighbors, many of whom several times have tried to completely wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Like when you have people like Hamas, like kind of, on state TV, indoctrinating kids to basically be suicide bombers and to kill Jews, etc., etc., you can kind of understand from their perspective why they might be a bit paranoid and why they might want to like overreact here, like kind of to what on the face of it might just be a few missiles, right? And also when you talk about like occupation, how many people, for instance, know that in the year 2000, the Israeli Prime Minister Barak, he offered for 100% of Gaza to be given to the Palestinians, and for 73% of West Bank to be given to the Palestinians, with there to be a phase-in system over the next like 10 to 25 years, so pretty much almost the time that like we're talking about right now, 25 years after 2000, it's almost now, right? So they would have given them up to 92% of West Bank. So how many people are aware of that Israel time and time again has offered land to be given to the Palestinians, and they said, right, all you've got to do is just agree to not like attack us anymore and to recognize our right to exist. And when that was offered, the Palestinians said no. So it's quite difficult to compromise, in a conflict like this, right, where you have people who, under no circumstances, are willing to, give land at all. And also, there's another talking point that people say with regard to Israel being an apartheid state. So if it's an apartheid state, I'm not saying that there's no discrimination against Arabs there, but, within Israel proper, there's about 20% of its population which are Arab speaking, right? In the northern region of Israel, there's actually a majority of people who live there who are Arabs. And while from 1948 to 1967, they were living under military occupation from the Israeli government, since 1967, they've had full citizen rights of like Israel. They serve in the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament. And while Jews are conscripted into the Israeli army, for the Israeli Arabs, they are allowed to volunteer to join, and many of them do. So I'm not saying that there's no discrimination against the Israeli Arabs, but how many people, for instance, are aware that in the year 2004, you had Lieberman, I don't know how to pronounce his first name, I'm not going to try it, right? But Lieberman, suggested there to be the so-called Lieberman plan. Some of the territory within West Bank is controlled by the Jews, like controlled by like Jewish settlers, and obviously, as I just said, like many places in the northern region of Israel are Arab, right? So he suggested there to be land swaps, right? So he basically said, right, some of these territories which are predominantly like Arab speaking on the borders, they should be given to Palestine. And what was the reaction of the Israeli Arabs, right? Were they all rushing to join with their brethren in Palestine? No, in actual fact, you found that a poll taken by an Arab-speaking newspaper at the time, in one of the communities that was there, they found that 83% of Israeli Arabs living in that community were opposed to joining with Palestine and wanted to stay with Israel. And that's obviously because Israel is a democratic state, it's a very prosperous state, etc., etc. And it's obviously, as much as it is officially the Jewish state of Israel, it still is a thing where all groups, all like ethnicities, all religions are still welcome to be there, right? And like they have a lot more freedom in Israel than they would within like any kind of like a Palestinian state. So, again, how many people are aware of this? Right? Yes, there's occupation, yes, like it's not like yes, there's many problems with it. It's definitely not like a perfect situation at all, right? Yes, there's many problems, and there's many flaws that the Israelis have, but at the same time, how many people are aware of like simple talking points like that when they're kind of arguing about these kind of issues? But of course, no conversation about like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, yeah, can really, you can't really talk about it without including what the people on the ground think of the situation, right? And that's where we look at an opinion poll. And I chose an opinion poll taken in 2017. So you had a recent flare up in 2014, and obviously you've had the recent flare up now in 2021. So I picked a poll taken in the middle of these kind of things. So this at a time when tensions aren't running too high. This is normal. Like this is 90% of the time, and people, even Palestinian tour guides, yeah, that I had, yeah, when I was out in like West Bank and stuff, yeah, they said like actually, what you see on the news, 90% of the time, people just going about living their everyday life and stuff. Yeah, normally there's peace, like the natural state of Israel and Palestine. As much as we often only see it when there's war, most of the time it's actually peace. But so this is in one of those long periods of peace, and this is what people in this region thought.